Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to talk about the price that the native people, the Africans on the land that was known as the East Africa Protectorate, which later on became the Kenyan colony and of course the Republic of Kenya in 1960s, the price the people had to pay because the British ended slave trade. Of course, slave trade was a major problem in East Africa before the arrival of the British. And I read somewhere in the book I'm reading now, and I'm reading The East Africa Protectorate by Sir Charles Eliot. And Sir Charles Eliot was the British Commissioner of East Africa. He was like the topmost British official in the land that was East Africa Protectorate that later on, of course, became the Kenyan colony. And in this book, he discusses many things, of course. And one of the things that he touches on is the issue of slavery. And he says that before the British stopped the trade, in course, the Arabs who were engaged in this trade had this rule of every family would give them maybe 2/3 of the kids that were born will go to slavery. So that's what happened. They will leave a few kids, of course. It's like breeding, we can't say. But of course, it was a major issue. They were taking people by force from not just the coastal areas, but even the interior societies. They will take people by force or maybe with collaboration by other people, and then they will go sell them. That was a huge trade, of course. And I need to say something just on the side that he does also talk about the Arab agriculture failing after the end of slavery at the coast because the Arabs did not know of any other way of getting labor. They only knew of getting slaves or buying slaves. So when that trade was ended, they basically could not run their farms. The farms just became so difficult for them to run. And in fact, many of the farms were sold to the Indians who could manage them better without having to rely on slaves. Now, coming back to this issue, of course, the British played a major role in ending that trade, and they would, of course, move along the Indian Ocean. And if they saw a ship with slaves, of course, they will stop it and they will return the people to the coast. And then, of course, they had to sign agreements and treaties with the Sultan of Zanzibar, who agreed to end that trade. And actually, the trade ended. Now, what I found so interesting reading this book is that the Africans were expected to pay for that, and the British were expecting the Africans to pay for that. Or rather, the British used that as an excuse to tax Africans. And I'm going to read that part of the book. He says, and taxes is the hat tax derived from a small annual payment of 2 or 3 rupees per hat by natives. This impost occasions no hardship and cannot be considered excessive if one considers how great and direct are the advantages which natives have derived from the establishment of our rule and the abolition of slave trade. The tax is collected without difficulty, and the missionaries who were consulted before it was levied offer no objection to it. It brings in at present about £16,000, but the amount is increasing every year as the influence of government becomes more extended. The increase in the census must also have a favorable effect on the receipts. In some districts, particularly on the coast, the slave trade was a terrible drain on the population, as more than half of the children were taken away. Now that this scourge has been removed, we may hope to witness a very material rise in numbers, and I see no reason why the hat tax should not gradually increase to about 35,000 in the next few years. At the present, the taxation of Europeans is extremely light, though some of the forms which it assumes, such as game licenses, cause irrigation and complaint. In fact, there is probably no country in the world where the incidences of taxation per head is so small, as there is no income tax, house tax, and land tax. A larger and more established white population may, however, find it to their own interest to contribute more largely to public funds. Now, there are a few things that comes up when you read this section of the book. Of course, number one, it justifies why the Africans needed to pay the hat tax. Of course, besides it being like payment to the British for ending slave trade, it was also a way to force the Africans to go seek work in the white settlements in the lands that were being run by the British farmers. It was like an incentive for them to go and work to provide, of course, labor. But he also says that that was little. According to him, it wasn't a lot. But he makes another statement that is interesting. He makes a statement that the Europeans were not paying much tax, that they were almost paying nothing besides paying for licenses and things like that. They were basically paying nothing. But of course, the Africans were expected to pay the taxes, the hard tax. But the Europeans were not even paying this something similar like a house tax or a land tax. They were not paying that, which is interesting that they expected the Africans to pay hard tax, but the Europeans were basically paying nothing. But it does, of course, say that going forward or in the future, it was likely that the Europeans were going to be persuaded to also pay taxes. So I found this to be so interesting because I've always known about the use of taxes to incentivize the Africans to go and look for work in the lands that were run by the British farmers. But I never saw it being justified the way it's doing in this book, that it was like they were paying for a benefit, basically, like they were paying to the British for ending slave trade. So I found that to be interesting. Those are my random thoughts.